The Prigozhin coup attempt in Russia was most likely fake. About 80% fake, with or without Prigozhin's knowledge of it being fake. And the reason for it was most likely to put Russia into a better position for the negotiations with the West. It is a card that has been played many, many times since 1991. So the Russians always argue, we're weak, we're unstable, and if the West puts too much pressure on us, if they demand too much, money to, repair Ukraine now or whatever, if the demands are too high, things are going to turn very chaotic in Russia. It's going to fall apart. You're going to have 10 military guys like Prigozhin becoming warlords, acquiring nuclear weapons, and then we're all going to die. This card has been played so many times. In 2010, when the plane went down carrying some of the most senior members of the Polish government, NATO kept quiet. 2014, takeover of Crimea, and many, many other instances and circumstances. Assassination attempts of defectors, poisoning them with radioactive polonium. The West always kept quiet, and instead of really going for it with the sanctions were pretty lowball for the most part for the longest time, right? So this was always kind of the line that was pushed, especially during the Bush administration from 2000 2008. This was even verbalized very clearly by Mr. Bush, right? So he said we need the Russians against China. We can't have Russia move too close to China. So we have to be forgiving and all that. So the war in Ukraine is probably going to end without a clear winner. So there's not going to be a military clear-cut victory. NATO has stepped on the brake paddle. I mean, from the beginning, from the get-go. So the weapons deliveries were really slow. They could have been much higher, but that would have put too much pressure on the Russians. So it is kind of likely the Russians will settle. Not guaranteed, though, but it's likely they will settle. And that will include many, many questions. What does Russia have to pay? What does Russia have to pay to rebuild Ukraine? What about the Ukrainian military? Is it allowed to grow? What about the pipelines? What about the sanctions? What about all of that? So this has to be ironed out during these negotiations. And the more the Russians can play that old card, the better for Russia. So they want to appear chaotic and weak to a certain degree. Now, NATO isn't stupid. Many academics who wrote about the Prigozhin episode, they're not stupid either. They probably know it's fake, but they're still afraid of the bigger overall picture, and they're jumping at this opportunity. They're playing into that Prigozhin coup narrative because that's going to facilitate a negotiation that's going to lead to a settling of affairs, apparently. So, I mean, what options does Russia have to improve their own position in the negotiations? So they can play weak, they can threaten nuclear weapons, which has been done quite a lot. They could also threaten an escalation, especially if China comes into play in North Korea. So they may supply the equipment, the ammo, and the soldiers. There's been public talk by a Russian government official who's tasked with, recruiting soldiers. And this guy recently said, well, we may get 500,000 North Korean soldiers and move them by train, move them to Ukraine. So there's always that possible escalation. So right when the coup attempt happened, I predicted what Western officials are going to say about it. And this happened exactly like I thought it would happen. And now you have, for example, the New York Times. They published an article, commentary, and it says that Putin is the best we can get. He's the devil that we know. I mean, since 1999, he's been formally running Russia. And except for the Ukraine war, no big thing happened. There's been no Armageddon. And so it's probably best, according to the New York Times, it's probably best if the Russians keep Putin and the system goes on. We all better forget the Ukraine war ever happened. We just turn back the clock, turn things back to where they were, mostly to back where things were. We forget it ever happened because every alternative is supposedly too dangerous, right? So there's no better person apparently to replace Putin. Other guys that may take power, they're more dangerous, they say. And so this is pretty much what we expected. But what does that mean if the West and Russia, if they settle about Ukraine? How long is this going to last? And is this just going to buy Russia more time to rebuild the economy, to rebuild the arms production, to further coordinate with the Chinese and North Korea, so we may get a few years of peace, and then there may be a coordinated strike in multiple places, strike by Russia, China, and North Korea. So the magic question is, the million-dollar question is, how close are these Eastern Bloc states, right? So some sharper observers, they have noted or have been noting for a while that Russia and China are much closer than they appear. Then you had the literature of Soviet defectors who told us that they're quite close, but I think it's even worse than that. If you study the history of the Chinese Revolution, you will notice that revolution was paid for by the Russians, it was trained by the Russians, it was equipped by the Russians, it was completely run by the Russians. And this was a Stalin takeover of China, using Mao and other people. So immediately after the revolution, the whole Chinese state was Sovietized. And you had Russians everywhere running things, and anytime a Chinese official lacked loyalty towards Moscow, that official was replaced. So when the Russians or the Soviets, when they took over countries in Eastern Europe, for example, like Ukraine or Poland back in the day, this was a complete takeover, and nobody will argue about that. This was just a Stalinist Soviet takeover. But when it came to Asia, for strategic reasons, a different picture was painted. It was claimed that China was sort of independent, and communist North Korea was supposedly independent, and they did their own thing, and they had all these supposed tensions with Moscow. But then if you look at North Korea, the original dictator Kim Il-sung, he was a communist guerrilla leader. He mostly worked with Chinese, and this was all Russian training, as I've mentioned. And the infamous Beria then recommended Kim Il-sung to Stalin as a potential new head of state or puppet guy for North Korea. So this was the recommendation. We use that guy because he has all the qualities that we're looking for. It's just one problem. He barely speaks any Korean because he's been fighting with the Chinese for so long. So they gave him a language course, and they got him into shape, and that's how that happened. And after a couple of years, Stalin gave the green light for the Korean War. And there's an interesting backstory to that. So, for example, American government officials claimed in public they do not care about the fate of Korea, so they wouldn't get involved. And also, corresponding false intelligence was disseminated, confirming that opinion. So that's why the Russians thought the Americans were for real. Korean War started, America got involved big time, and that's how that happened. It's an interesting parallel because the sensible thing to do had been to just split Korea in the middle, have a communist part and a non-communist part. This would have been the smart and easy thing to do. But then it became a huge war going back and forth, and eventually they would all settle by splitting Korea in the middle. One of the sharpest observers during the Cold War was Professor Carroll Quigley, a leading expert on security matters and empires. And he was often misquoted by the conspiracy guys, but he made it fairly clear that he considered the conspiracy guys to be severely misguided, and he gave his opinion on the superpowers back then, which were two of them, the United States and Soviet Russia, or the Soviet Union. And Quigley understood that in the atomic age, a true conflict between the superpowers made no sense whatsoever. And he considered it to be sort of a deadlock and an unofficial, let's say, cartel. I don't think he ever used that word in his book, Tragedy and Hope. So you have to get through the first 800 boring pages or so until you get to the really interesting part. And so in this deadlock situation, the smartest thing for the superpowers would be to talk loud, act very conservatively, and stage proxy wars every now and then. Because it's easy to do because of modern weapon systems. You can start a war anywhere, anytime. You can prolong the war, you can shorten the war, and you can end the war as you see fit. So the big fear of the Americans and the Russians was not really a third world war between the superpowers, you know, and then to really try to get each other, to get the other side. No, that made no sense. The smart thing to do was to have these proxy wars, scare the entire world, and prevent other normal countries from rising up and becoming powerful, because those countries could threaten the status of the superpowers. The researcher Anthony Sutton had spent decades of his professional career detailing the technology sales from the West to the Eastern Bloc, and it was incredible. It was really, really substantial. He estimated 95% of all Soviet technology was really Western technology. And if you view it as a whole, you know, the picture becomes much clearer. If you just look at single events, there's always been stupid excuses. For example, trying to build up Russia to keep it separate from China or whatever, and to play off Russia against China. These sort of things. So that game was played a lot. Now today, the most important supplier for Russia in terms of technological components used for weapon systems, the most important supplier for the Russians, the most important supplier is the United States of America. This is according to the latest intelligence, the latest reports. So American companies sell these components to foreign countries, especially China. And then through shell companies, these components are then resold and redeclared, and then they end up in Russian systems. So Russia could not have been fighting this war. They would have not even attempted the invasion of Ukraine had it not been for these components and the steady flow of things. You know, it's computer chips and many, many other things. We may be dealing with an actual secret hidden cartel of the superpowers, and you need to keep that in mind whatever happens in the next couple of years. So right now, the situation is this. NATO is giving the Russians more time and more appeasement, and there's always an excuse for that. So you gotta appease the Russians so they don't get closer to China and whatever, and then we have to appease China so they don't do anything stupid and they prevent them from getting closer to Russia. There's always a stupid excuse, but the end result is always the same. It's this triple, cartel of superpowers running things, and everybody else is just following along.